collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
This week, Cyprus gets a rap on the knuckles from the European Union over the presumption of innocence.
Cyprus did not put in place any mechanism to check and to hold accountable public persons who make statements to the press about people arrested or charged, who are often portrayed as guilty before they are even presented into court.
And we discuss the latest protocols to try and control the COVID pandemic.
I think it's going to drive the message home that things are at a knife edge. We either control it now or we'll have to put up with a local lockdown.
We're joined on the programme this week by a legal expert on fundamental rights, because Cyprus has received a warning from the European Union, and it's all to do with the presumption of innocence. Corina Dimitriou, welcome back to the programme, and please explain to us why we got this letter. And there has, I think, been on social media a little bit of a commentary about all of this as well. So can you put us in the picture?
Yes, the presumption of innocence was initially protected in the Constitution that was handed down by the British administration, but also through a directive of the European Union which required all member states to introduce special safeguards and mechanisms to ensure that it is observed. Cyprus did not put in place any mechanism to check and to hold accountable public persons who make statements to the press about people arrested or charged, who are often portrayed as guilty before they are even presented into court. This is a long-standing problem in Cyprus. It is not new. Some years ago, we had an acquittal of the musician Doros Georgiadis because he was considered that he did not have a fair trial as a result of the various public statements made about his case. You remember he was accused of child abuse. He was convicted at the lower court, and then his conviction was reversed at the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court found he could not possibly have had a fair trial with all the media coverage of the case. So the law recognizes that when so much is written and so much is said from public persons, the environment is not healthy, is not conducive to a fair trial. So this is what the infringement proceedings warning is about. We don't have a mechanism to protect persons accused or persons arrested from public statements made by public figures such as government ministers, police press officers, mayors, politicians. This was the case also before the transposition of the directive, and it's also the case here. You probably remember the case of the British tourist who complained of gang raped by a group of Israeli youth, where the mayor of Ayia Napa launched a campaign against her, claiming that she had lied. Eventually, the entire media coverage should have been sufficient so that she would not be convicted, but instead she was convicted, and there was no measure against the mayor and against all the public persons who claimed that she was lying. We also have the case of Dinos Theodoulou, the demonstrator at Lydra Street during the protests against the closure of the checkpoints, where there was a montaged video playing in social media, and suddenly, before he was even charged, we had statements from the chief of police, the justice minister, the interior minister, the government spokesman, practically everybody saying that he will get a severe punishment. So they all essentially stepped into the shoes of the prosecutor and the court. Their statements were multiplied and amplified by the media, and we had the entire country against the person before he even appeared in court. This is not a healthy environment for a fair trial, and I do not believe that you will have a fair trial after all this public show.
I find it extraordinary that we have in our government ministries, in our legislature, and pretty well everywhere in Cyprus, an awful lot of lawyers, including the president himself, the justice minister. Why is this being allowed to happen? And in some cases, they are the people at fault themselves. Don't they know the law?
I'm sure that even if they don't know the law, they have a sufficient number of advisors around them. And I have the same question like you do. Why is this happening? Why is there such a need to inform and assure the public that justice will be done? But justice is not going to be done by the executive. It's going to be done by the judiciary. And in fact, if we want to preserve the separation of powers, it's none of their business what the judiciary will do. If the person charged is not happy with the ruling that they get from the judiciary, then the next level is the ECHR. It's not the government. It's generally a bad practice that has been going on for decades. It's not a new thing.
Right, but there's two things that spring to mind. First of all, let's deal with the role of the media, and I'm talking about the press, TV, radio, newspapers, magazines. They surely do have to report things, so where do you draw the line between reporting? I mean, for example, if a minister comes out and says something that is considered to be detrimental to a potential defendant before they're taken to court, should that not be reported?
The directive attempts to draw the line, although I agree with you, it's not always easy to draw it. But one thing that is very clear in the directive is that people should not be portrayed as guilty. And in order to do this, first of all, they should not appear in handcuffs. They should not be referred to by public persons as being guilty. There's a set of guidelines. They should not be wearing prison clothes when they are transported to court. They should not be videoed in the court building. This is something that actually the media does quite often. And it looks like nobody feels is responsible to stop the media from videoing people getting out of the police van and walking into the courtroom. The policemen do not feel it's their job to stop the media, and there is actually nobody to stop the media from doing this, and no repercussions from the media who do this. And after you have all these images parading on your TV screen, if you are the judge, then you can understand that when you sit behind the bench and try to try this person, you have already in your mind decided that he's guilty.
Well, hopefully you're not a judge if that's the case. I mean, one has to say that judges are supposed to be able to be above that sort of thing.
Judges will claim that we are professionals and we know our job and we are sufficiently trained to put these images aside, but they're also people. They are mixing with society. It's impossible to claim that they cannot be influenced, and in fact the legislature has recognized this. That's why we have these guidelines to remove the pressure from the judges' minds. And the Supreme Court has recognized this on many occasions. The problem we have is that the court itself is very unlikely to say, because of this coverage, this extensive media coverage, I cannot give an objective ruling. This is more likely to happen at the next level, upon appeal. And by then, this person has been in the media for 6 years or even more. And once he gets his acquittals, nobody will bother to report that he has been acquitted.
Well, that's definitely very true. Let's come on, if we may, to the role of social media. It seems to me that pretty well everyone on Cyprus uses Facebook extensively. And, all right, they're also sharing local mainstream media reports, but it's getting multiplied on social media. And then, of course, you get the comments underneath, which presumably make it even worse.
Exactly. And and a year later Facebook will remind you that this happened, so you have the chance to bring it again into the public sphere and to have again the same line of comments under that. It's basically out of control. This is why it's very important to stop this from happening at the source. And usually the source are the authorities themselves, because this is where the case assumes validity. When a justice minister refers to arrested persons as guilty, it's very likely that this statement will be taken for granted and then reproduced massively.
Now, you're referring, I think, to statements made after the riots in Limassol last week.
That's right, yes. At the time, in fact, on the very day that the government received the warning letter from the EU, the public minister made a public statement that, I will quote exactly, "I am troubled by the age of the arrested persons and the fact that some of them are asylum seekers, young persons who are applying to stay in our country and commit such acts."
That's a presumption of guilt right there, is it not?
Yes, but there's also some data protection issues here. Why would she have to mention that they're young? Why would she have to mention that they're asylum seekers? How does that help? Why is that in the public interest? Why would that have to become public? And I think there is no answer to that question. It was unnecessary personal data given to the press at a time when the court itself could not see the connection between these persons and the acts they were charged with. That's why they were not remanded in custody. They were arrested some hours later, some miles away from the events, and they were charged with things that they probably knew nothing about. And then a few hours later, we have the justice minister basically portraying them as guilty.
What's to be done?
What's to be done? There's lots of solutions. I would start probably with a set of guidelines put together by a legal team on what public persons should say and what they should not say, and introduce a procedure where they would become liable if they violate the guidelines. I'm not sure if the Ministry of Justice is ready to examine such a procedure.
Hang on a minute. Are you saying that these guidelines would have to come from the Ministry of Justice, which is one of the ministers we've just been talking about, who obviously doesn't know the procedures?
I would prefer to see a legal team. There's lots of legal minds around that they would be happy to sit together and produce guidelines, which also exist in many other countries, about what public persons should and should not say. And in fact, I think the general advice is that they should say as little as possible when there are judicial proceedings coming up.
So we would expect more of them to say, X case is going to court, I can't comment. Finished.
That would have been ideal, and in fact, this is what the police is doing. The police is more careful in its statements, because I think that they are better trained. Although we have seen some statements out of line, but the general rule is that they say less than what politicians do. They are less concerned with making an impression that justice is being served.
Right, let's go back to where we started, and that is this warning from the EU. Do you know what happens next? What do we have to do to, if you like, get ourselves off the hook?
I think that the warning letter gives them 2 months to respond about what their intentions are in terms of introducing a mechanism for the implementation of the directive, and then it will decide on whether it will start infringement proceedings. If Cyprus is taken to the European Court, it's likely to face a hefty fine, I think.
Corina Dimitriou, legal expert, particularly with regard to human rights. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Rosie.
You can subscribe to the Cyprus News Digest on iTunes for free and get the program downloaded to your phone or tablet so you can listen anytime, anywhere.
The President of the Republic and the Health Minister held press conferences earlier this week to announce new measures to try and curb the rise we've had in coronavirus cases. Joining us is Peter Karagiannis, Professor at the University of Nicosia Medical School, to tell us what the new measures are and how, or if, they're going to help. Peter, thanks very much indeed for joining us again. First and foremost, can you outline what's different this time from what we already had in place?
The difference is that the measures which were used firstly in the case of the Larnaca outbreak and they paid off, they were applied to Limassol and Paphos, but the number of cases was such that possibly they did not work as quickly as one would have expected, and in an attempt to control the further increase in the number of cases, the announcements today say the following. First of all, the initial measures apply now to the whole of Cyprus, in other words, the other districts also. There have been additional measures introduced in the case of Limassol and Paphos, which restrict completely the activities below 18 years of age, whether this is football training, dancing, any activity that involves the concentration of people in enclosed areas in large numbers or largish numbers.
So you're talking there, if I may interrupt, about extracurricular activities, but the schools aren't going to close.
The schools are not going to close, and in addition, they have restricted the number of people at weddings and christenings and other parties. They're not allowing cocktails and no congratulations at weddings, just sit-down meals and 6 people per table.
Peter, let me interrupt you there. A lot of people, since those measures were brought in last time, said, hang on a minute, you're only allowed 10 people in a house, but you can have 350 people at a wedding dinner as long as they're in tables of 6. A lot of people said, that's ridiculous.
Yes, that's been reduced now to 150.
Isn't it still ridiculous?
Well, it's more manageable and...
Manageable for who? Will it stop the spread?
Yes, at least in the weddings and such like, we've not seen any transmissions in that setting. So hopefully we won't see any from now on. Let me say that the problem is Limassol. Limassol has got a huge number by Cyprus standard of cases. Limassol has got twice as many cases as the rest of the other districts. So the concentration of cases in Limassol is such that they've introduced these extra measures, and in addition they're encouraging all the businesses to operate half of their staff from home. In other words, teleworking. And the other thing they said is that they will provide economical support for business that are going to suffer. And these new restrictions for Limassol and Paphos actually are for a fortnight from the 5th of November.
Right, now can I ask you something else? Because we saw the spike in Limassol and Paphos, then we had the curfew there. And it was well known, I think, to many of us that particularly young people were just heading out of Limassol, for example, to Nicosia to do their partying and heading back again. Wouldn't it make more sense to put some sort of a limit on who can travel from one district to another rather than just putting curfews everywhere?
This is restricted now. There is a curfew now from 11 o'clock until 5 o'clock in the morning throughout the island, in an attempt to control just that.
Yeah, but the kids in Limassol were coming up to Nicosia to party and then heading back to Limassol.
Yes, but now...
they'll have to head back half an hour earlier, basically.
Well, an hour earlier.
And what different... Come on.
It's not worth the trouble coming now.
Do you think that really will make a difference to curtailing the spread?
I think it will, actually, because I think it's going to drive the message home that things are at a knife edge. We either control it now, or we'll have to put up with a local lockdown.
Now, what did you read into the messages from the President and the Health Minister today? They both warned everybody that this was the next step, but I got the feeling from my limited Greek that they were saying if this doesn't work, we will have to go further. What would be further?
Well, it will be local lockdowns, which will affect the town of Limassol. I mean, there have been a couple of outbreaks in villages, one in Polychrysochous and the other one in Kiperunda. There, the communities themselves put themselves under conditions of lockdown. So they're small communities, they know each other, so there's only small coffee shops, so they've cut down on going to these coffee shops. The coffee shops are shut, therefore they're restricted in their own homes.
What about the support for businesses and particularly self-employed people who now find themselves back almost where we were in full lockdown without being able to make a living?
Yeah. Well, the President and the Minister of Health said that there will be announcements tomorrow by the Minister for Labour, and then the day after by the Finance Minister on packages for support of such businesses. So there is going to be some sort of support, but exactly what they haven't said anything about.
Now, this is a bit unfair, Peter, because I know you're a scientist and not an economist.
I'm not a
but
politician. So.
Let me also ask you, I mean, have you any idea how long these support mechanisms could last? Because we don't seem to think that there's going to be a vaccine certainly this year. We don't even know if one comes out next year whether it's going to be efficient enough to, let's say, make the whole community immune to this. How long can these sort of support measures go on before it's everyone for himself?
I think the support measures will certainly be there until probably Christmas time, when everybody is hoping that one of the vaccines will get the license or the go-ahead by the like the Food and Drug Administration in the US and the equivalent one in Europe. I'm very optimistic about the AstraZeneca vaccine. There are soundings that the vaccine has been equally good in the elderly and in high-risk groups, and that the immunity that the vaccine generates is both antibodies and cellular immunity. We need both of these if we are to fight the infection adequately. So there is very good news there, and in fact I think the company was planning to submit a preliminary application with details to start the process and give the safety data at a later stage so that things are not delayed.
Right, now then they have to, if I'm right, do third-tier testing, so they need to test this on real people to see what the side effects are. Have they done that yet? And do we also know how long the immunity these vaccines give last?
Yeah. The phase 3 trials, as they are called, they're coming to an end. These trials have involved well over 30,000 people around the world, particularly in countries where the virus was rampant, like Brazil, US, South Africa, and India. The immunity so far seems to be at a level equivalent to what one sees in people who have recovered, particularly in those that have developed symptoms. We know the immunity is not so good in the asymptomatic people, but in people with symptoms, the immunity seems to last at least for 6-7 months, because this is as long we've had the chance to follow people who got the virus around March. So we need to wait a bit longer. And of course, with the vaccine trials, we need to wait until the middle of next year. However, the governments are very keen to start vaccinating people for obvious reasons. And as you said, the vaccination program will go hand in hand with us living with the virus around us. Therefore, we'll still need to sort of keep our distance, wear our masks, and wash our hands, etc. But as time progresses, these measures will be relaxed one by one, and hopefully by next autumn, a sufficient number of people will have been vaccinated, and our herd immunity will be at a level that we will not be worrying about widespread transmission.
My first thought is you're talking about that's a year away. Are we going to have to get used to the idea that for the next 12 months perhaps we're going to have to do very much what we've been doing for the last 6 months?
Yes, but perhaps the worry will not be there so much, because as you vaccinate people and as people are exposed to the virus, the immunity will continue increasing. And we mustn't forget that the people who are going to get the vaccine first will be the elderly and the high-risk groups.
And have they been tested in terms of this third phase of side effects of the vaccine?
Yes.
Because that's the other thing. Who puts themselves up for these tests? It's mostly younger people. So how do you know that if you're going to put that vaccine out into elderly and vulnerable people, there won't be different side effects and it will also have a proper protection?
Yeah, because these phase 3 trials have included volunteers from age groups above 55 and below 18 year old, as well as people from high-risk groups. And therefore, the information is there, and I know because I have inside information that it works in those individuals also. So that's why I'm saying, the information coming out from the Oxford group is very encouraging. There haven't been any more unexpected side effects following this large number of vaccinated people. There have only been 3 cases, all linked to underlying neurological conditions, which the volunteers did not declare. So if the worst comes to the worst, the vaccine will not be recommended for people with neurological problems.
So that's going to leave maybe a little gap in the population. But Peter, if you look at the overall situation at the moment in Cyprus, we've had our spike, we're trying to control it.
Yes.
Do you think it can be controlled before the end of the year, or are we really going to need to go back into a lockdown until these vaccines are available?
No, I think we will be able to control it. I think following these new measures, people will realize the seriousness of the situation. A lot of them who call me are extremely worried. It's just a matter of convincing those who don't believe that this virus exists, they don't like the masks, and they think that all this is a ploy to destroy the economy of the world. If we convince those to at least oblige for a fortnight or 3 weeks, then I'm sure we can control it. Already I'm seeing positive signs. Our numbers are coming down, and I know from the analysis that the measures are already paying off, but we need something more to speed things up.
Well, I think none of us like wearing the masks, but I think an awful lot of us realise that certainly in places where there are other people, we need to wear them. Can I just ask you one last thing? Because I was quite shocked when the last decree came out about wearing masks when you're outside. And I'm thinking, if I'm walking to the kiosk and there's nobody else around me, why do I need to wear a mask? I put it on when I go into the kiosk. Your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's necessary, but unfortunately that's what the decree says, so let's do it.
No, Peter, sorry, I have to take issue on this, because if you have something that is obviously rather silly, then it makes people lose confidence in the other decrees that you put out that possibly are really quite important.
Yes. The thing is that if there is a widespread transmission in the community...
Can you get it from walking to the kiosk?
It depends who's sort of walked past you, or, you know, a few moments before you and his knees.
I'm talking about in a relatively deserted street. I'm not talking about in the big shopping centres, Peter.
Yeah.
If I'm out walking around my neighbourhood and nobody else is in sight, why do I need to wear a mask?
Well, perhaps that's a question you should ask the minister.
I think perhaps I will try to do that.
I was against it, if you want to know, but they went for it, so we can't do otherwise.
No, fair enough. You're being very diplomatic, but all right. I just thought I'd throw that at you.
Just before. He reiterated that just before, so we'll have to live with it.
All right. Peter Karayan, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for joining me.
Same here. Bye-bye.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.